"Excuse me, sweetheart, but I think you're in the wrong seat." The man's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a distinct, polished edge of condescension that cut through the low hum of the Boeing 737's auxiliary power unit. Leslie Arnold didn't immediately look up from the tablet resting on her knees. She kept her eyes fixed on the digital pages of the novel she was pretending to read, taking a slow, measured breath. She was seated in 14A, the window seat of the exit row, a prime spot she had paid extra for to accommodate the chronic ache in her right knee, a souvenir from a rough ejection 12 years ago that never quite healed right. She wore a simple, elegant royal blue blouse that complemented her long blonde hair, which fell in loose waves over her shoulders. To the casual observer, she looked like a marketing executive or perhaps a school teacher heading home after a conference. There was nothing about her attire that screamed military. No camouflage, no tactical boots, no aggressive sunglasses worn indoors. Just a woman in a blue top trying to get from San Diego to Nellis Air Force Base without incident. I said. "Excuse me," the man repeated, his voice dropping an octave, aiming for authority. He tapped the hard plastic of the overhead bin above her, the sound sharp and irritating. "I believe you are in my row, and I need this bin space for my equipment. It's delicate." Leslie finally turned her head. The man standing in the aisle was tall, wearing a suit that cost more than her first car, with a face that had likely been handsome before it settled into a permanent expression of impatience. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a garment bag in the other, blocking the flow of passengers boarding behind him. "I'm in 14A, Leslie said, her voice calm, devoid of the irritation starting to prickle at the base of her neck. She held up her boarding pass, displaying the bold alphanumeric code. The man, whose name was Grant according to the platinum luggage tag swinging aggressively from his bag, squinted at the pass and then sighed, a sound of theatrical exhaustion. "Look, the gate agents make mistakes. This is the exit row. It requires passengers who are physically capable of operating the emergency door and assisting others. Usually they put sturdier individuals here." Leslie blinked. The implication hung in the stagnant cabin air, heavy and sour. She looked down at her own hands, resting on her lap. They were manicured, the skin soft, but underneath lay tendons of steel and muscle memory forged in high-G environments that would make this man pass out before he could finish his sentence. "I am capable," she said simply. Grant chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He turned to the people waiting behind him, seeking allies in his frustration. A line had formed, stretching back toward the galley. Directly behind Grant stood 3 young men in polo shirts and khakis, their haircuts high and tight, their posture rigid. They were clearly military, likely junior officers, vibrating with that specific energy of young aviators on leave. Grant smirked at them, jerking a thumb toward Leslie. "I'm sure she's capable of waiting for her husband, right, gentlemen? But when the turbulent air hits, we need someone who can lift 50 pounds without breaking a nail." One of the young men, a redhead with a constellation of freckles across his nose, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Leslie, then back at Grant. "Sir, we're just trying to get to our seats," he mumbled, avoiding the conflict. Grant didn't take the hint. He turned back to Leslie, his patience evaporating. "Listen, miss, I work with the Defense Department. I'm a consultant for Lockheed. I fly this route weekly. I have status. If I call the flight attendant over, they're just going to move you to a standard seat where you'll be more comfortable. Why don't we save everyone the trouble? You grab your purse, I'll take the window, and you can take my seat back in 22C. It's an aisle, easier for the restroom." Leslie felt the old familiar coldness settle in her chest. It was the same icy clarity she used to feel when the canopy closed and the world narrowed down to a heads-up display in the horizon. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply locked eyes with him. "I'm staying right here," she said. Grant's face reddened. He jammed his garment bag into the bin directly above her head, slamming the latch shut with unnecessary force. "Fine. Have it your way. But when the stewardess comes by, we're having a chat about safety regulations." He squeezed into the middle seat, 14B, encroaching immediately on her armrest. He spread his knees wide, asserting his dominance over the physical space, forcing Leslie to press herself against the cabin wall. She turned her face toward the window, watching the ground crew toss luggage onto the conveyor belt below. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to center herself. She wasn't Leslie Arnold, the tired traveler being mansplained to by a defense contractor. She was a retired lieutenant colonel with 3,000 flight hours. She was a ghost. She was ice. The 3 young men shuffled into the row behind them. They were loud, filled with the bravado of youth. Leslie could hear every word through the gap between the seats. "Man, did you see the angle of attack on that brake?" the redhead was saying. "I thought Miller was going to stall it out." He was pushing the envelope. Another voice replied, deeper, more confident. That's what the F-35 is for. You can't fly it like a Viper. The computer does the thinking. You just have to trust the systems. Grant, sensing an opportunity to stroke his own ego, twisted in his seat to face the young pilots behind him. He flashed a practiced, oily smile. You boys flying the Lightning too? He asked, interrupting their conversation. The redhead looked surprised but nodded. Yes, sir. Just finished transition training. Heading to our first operational squadron. Grant nodded knowingly, puffing out his chest. Fantastic machine. I consult on the logistics side for the avionics packages. I was just telling the lady here, he gestured vaguely toward Leslie without looking at her, that you have to understand the specs to really appreciate what that bird can do. It's not a car. You can't just put anyone behind the wheel. Leslie bit the inside of her cheek. The avionics package he was likely referring to was the one she had beta tested 7 years ago. She remembered the glitches, the terrifying moment the display had ghosted out over the Nevada desert, forcing her to fly by feel and instinct until the system rebooted. She had written the scathing report that forced the contractor to redesign the entire interface. Is that right, sir? The deep-voiced pilot asked, polite but disinterested. Oh, absolutely, Grant continued, oblivious to their lack of interest. It's a beast, requires a certain aggression, a mindset. That's why the selection process is so rigorous. They weed out the weak ones early. He cast a sideways glance at Leslie, who was staring out the window, her reflection showing a neutral, unreadable expression. My wife, Grant went on, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible to Leslie. She gets nervous just merging onto the highway. Can you imagine her trying to handle 9 Gs? Biology is biology, right, fellas? The pilots behind them went silent. It was an awkward, heavy silence. They were young, but they had been trained in a modern military that was vastly different from the one Grant imagined. They knew women who flew. They knew women who killed. But they were also junior officers, and this man was claiming to be a senior industry partner. The hierarchy of the military mind struggled with the social awkwardness of the moment. Leslie didn't react. She let the insult slide over her like rain over a canopy, but her hand drifted down to her carry-on bag tucked under the seat in front of her. It was a battered, olive-drab flight bag that had seen better days. Attached to the handle was a faded, scratched coin and a tag that read simply, "Remove before flight." The boarding continued. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts. When the attendant reached their row, Grant raised his hand, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Excuse me, miss," he said to the attendant. "I have a concern about the exit row criteria. I'm not sure the passenger in 14A meets the physical requirements to assist in an emergency. I'd feel safer if we had someone stronger in that position. Perhaps one of the gentlemen behind us." The flight attendant, a woman in her 40s who looked like she had been dealing with men like Grant for 2 decades, looked at Leslie. "Ma'am, are you willing and able to assist in the event of an emergency?" she asked, following the script. "Yes," Leslie said. Her voice was steady, resonant. She looked at Grant. "Sir," she has confirmed. "Please fasten your seatbelt." But Grant spluttered, his face darkening. "It's not just about saying yes, it's about capability. If that door weighs 60 pounds, the door weighs 45 pounds. Leslie interrupted. She didn't look at him. She spoke to the window. It opens inward, and then swings out. The locking mechanism requires a dual hand rotation of 90 degrees counterclockwise. Grant froze. The specificity of the detail caught him off guard. He scoffed, recovering quickly. "Reading the safety card, are we? Good for you, sweetheart. Reading is fundamental. But doing it is another thing." He turned back to the pilots behind him, rolling his eyes. "See what I mean? They memorize the book but don't understand the physics." The plane began to push back. The safety demonstration played. The engines whined to life. As they taxied, the vibration of the aircraft seemed to loosen the tongues of the young pilots behind them again. They started talking about call signs, the sacred currency of the fighter pilot community. "I'm telling you, Boots is a terrible call sign," the redhead complained. "I need to do something cool to earn a new one before we get to the squadron." "You don't pick your call sign, rookie," the deep voice laughed. "You earn it by screwing up or doing something memorable. You think Viper picked her call sign?" Leslie's heart skipped a beat. She kept staring out the window, watching the runway markers blur past. "Who?" the third pilot asked. "Viper," the deep voice said, a tone of reverence creeping in. "Colonel Arnold. Legend has it she brought a bird back with half a vertical stabilizer missing during a red flag exercise. Didn't eject. Landed it on a strip of highway because she didn't want to crash into a populated area." "No way," the redhead said. That's just a bar story. It's in the logs, the deep voice insisted. My instructor at Shepherd flew with her. Said she was the quietest pilot on the comms he ever heard. Never panicked. They called her the Silent Death before she got the Viper tag. She was the first woman to instructor certify on the F-35 Block 3 variant. Leslie closed her eyes. The memory hit her hard. The screaming alarm of the hydraulic failure, the shudder of the airframe, the ground rushing up too fast, the absolute crystalline silence in her mind as she calculated the glide slope. She hadn't been thinking about being a woman, or a hero, or a legend. She had been thinking about the school bus she had seen 3 miles off her nose and how she wasn't going to hit it. Grant, who had been listening in, decided to impart his wisdom again. You boys are talking about ancient history, Grant said, leaning back so his head was near the gap between the seats. And half those stories are PR fluff. The military loves to prop up a few female pilots for the posters. I've seen the data. Their reaction times just aren't the same under sustained G-load. It's simple physiology. The pilots went silent again. This time the silence was sharper. Sir, with all respect, the deep-voiced pilot said, his tone icy. Viper is the reason the F-35 has the current G-limiter override protocols. She test-piloted the fix. She pulled 9.5 Gs to prove the airframe could handle it when the engineers said it would snap. Grant waved a hand dismissively. Engineers know better. Pilots are just jockeys. The plane accelerated, pressing them into their seats. They lifted off, the ground falling away. As the seatbelt sign chimed off at 10,000 feet, Grant immediately unbuckled, stretching his legs out as far as he could, encroaching on Leslie's footwell. He opened his laptop, typing furiously, elbowing Leslie every time he hit the return key. Sorry, busy workspace, he muttered, not sounding sorry at all. Leslie pulled her flight bag out from under the seat to retrieve her water bottle. As she did, the bag shifted. The remove before flight tag flipped over. Underneath it, dangling from a heavy brass ring, was a small, uniquely shaped patch velcroed to the canvas. It was a black shield with a silver lightning bolt and a hooded cobra. The redhead pilot in the row behind leaned forward to grab a magazine from the seat pocket. His eyes caught the patch on the bag resting on Leslie's knees. He froze. He blinked, looked closer, then looked at the back of Leslie's head. He looked at the royal blue blouse, the blonde hair. He looked back at the patch. Hey, check 6, the redhead whispered to the pilot next to him. Look, the deep-voiced pilot, check 6, leaned forward. What? The bag. Look at the patch. Check 6 squinted. His eyes widened. That's the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron patch. But it's the vintage one. The one from the initial Joint Strike Fighter cadre. Where did she get that? The redhead whispered. Maybe she bought it at an army surplus store. You don't buy that patch, Check 6 murmured. You earn that patch. Grant, sensing movement, turned around. What are you boys staring at? My monitor? I've got proprietary schematics here, so eyes front. Sir, the redhead said, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. We're looking at the lady's bag. Grant snorted. Is it interfering with your legroom too? I told her it was too big. He turned to Leslie. You see, you're causing a scene with your luggage. I told you to check it. Leslie slowly turned her head. She looked at Grant, and for the first time she let the mask slip. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a hardness that felt like looking down the barrel of a cannon. The bag is within regulation dimensions, she said quietly, and the patch stays with me. Grant rolled his eyes. It's a souvenir, sweetheart. Probably your husband's, right? Or maybe you picked it up at an air show to look tough. It's stolen valor, you know, wearing things you didn't earn. He reached out, his hand moving to flick the tag on her bag. Don't touch it, Leslie said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The kind of command that stops a flight line crew in their tracks. Grant pulled his hand back, startled by the intensity in her voice. Whoa, easy there. Just admiring the merchandise. No need to get hysterical. Behind them, Check 6 unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up in the aisle. He was a big man, over 6 feet, filling the vertical space of the cabin. He looked down at Leslie, ignoring Grant completely. Ma'am, he said, his voice respectful, cautious. Excuse me. Leslie looked up. Her blue eyes met his brown ones. She saw the wings on his chest, the eagerness, the respect. She softened. Yes, Lieutenant? She asked. Check 6 swallowed. I know this is strange, but that patch, and your call sign tag, it says Viper. Grant laughed loudly, slapping his knee. Viper. You've got to be kidding me. Did you get that off a customized license plate? Check 6 didn't look at Grant. He kept his eyes locked on Leslie. Are you Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Arnold? The cabin seemed to go silent. Passengers in the surrounding rows, sensing the shift in energy, lowered their phones and took off their headphones. Grant looked from the pilot to Leslie, a frown creasing his forehead. Leslie sighed, a small, weary smile touching her lips. She reached into her bag and pulled out a challenge coin. It wasn't the shiny, mass-produced kind. It was heavy, blackened metal, shaped like the tail fin of an F-35. She held it up. "I've been retired for 3 years, Lieutenant," she said. "I go by Leslie now. But yes." Check 6's face went pale, then flushed with a rush of blood. He stepped out into the aisle, standing at rigid attention despite the cramped space. "Oh my God," he breathed. The other 2 pilots unbuckled and popped up like toast, crowding into the aisle, craning their necks. "Is it her?" the redhead asked. "It's her," Check 6 whispered. "It's Viper." Grant looked confused, his arrogance wavering for the first time. Who is she?" Check 6 looked down at Grant, his expression transforming from polite deference to cold disgust. "Sir, you are sitting next to the finest fighter pilot in the United States Air Force's history," Check 6 said, his voice booming slightly, projecting to the rows of passengers watching. "Colonel Arnold logged more combat hours in the F-35 than anyone. She led the first strike wing into the Levant. She's the reason half the tactics we learn in school even exist." Grant blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "But, she's what?" Leslie asked, turning to him. Her voice was conversational, pleasant, which made it all the more terrifying. "Too small? Too blonde?" Grant stammered. I mean, you don't look like I can pull 9 Gs, Leslie finished for him. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Grant and the pilots could hear. "You know, the funny thing about the F-35 is that the jet doesn't care how much you bench press. It cares about how fast you process information. It cares about whether you panic when the warning lights turn red. And in my experience, the ones who talk the loudest about how tough they are usually black out first." Grant shrank back into his seat, pressing himself against the armrest he had previously claimed as his own. The redhead pilot leaned over the seat back, beaming. "Colonel, I wrote my senior thesis at the Academy on your suppression of enemy air defense tactics, the Arnold maneuver." Leslie smiled, a genuine warm smile this time. "Just don't try it below 5,000 feet, Lieutenant. The simulator doesn't account for the thermal updrafts correctly." The flight attendant who had been watching the exchange from the galley walked over. She had sensed the tension earlier and now saw the shift in power dynamics. She looked at Grant, who was now staring at his laptop screen with intense, fake concentration, his face a mottled red. "Everything okay here?" the attendant asked, a knowing glint in her eye. Check 6 smiled at the attendant. "Everything is fine, ma'am. We just realized we're in the presence of royalty." He looked at Grant. "Sir, if you're uncomfortable in the exit row, I'd be happy to trade seats with the colonel. We could talk shop, real shop. Since you're a consultant, maybe you'd like to sit back in row 22 and listen." Grant didn't look up. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Actually," Leslie said, stretching her legs out into the space Grant had vacated. "I'm quite comfortable now." She looked at the young pilots. "But when we land, I'd love to hear about your transition training. Drinks are on me." Check 6 grinned. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you will never buy a drink in a bar where we are present. That's a standing order." Leslie chuckled and turned back to the window. As she did, she caught Grant's reflection in the glass. He looked smaller, deflated, a man whose worldview had been punctured by the reality sitting inches away from him. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, you flew the combat variants?" Leslie didn't look at him. She just watched the clouds drifting by, white and peaceful. "I didn't just fly them, Grant," she said softly. "I taught them how to fight. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to finish my book. It requires a lot of concentration." Grant fell silent. He closed his laptop. He moved his elbow off the armrest. He sat with his hands folded in his lap for the remaining 3 hours of the flight, staring straight ahead, terrified to make a sound. Behind them, the 3 young pilots sat in a reverent silence, occasionally whispering to each other like schoolboys who had just met Superman. When the plane landed at the destination, the dynamic of the deplaning process was entirely different. Usually, people rushed to stand up, crowding the aisle. But as the seatbelt sign dinged off, Check 6 and his wingmen stood up immediately and blocked the aisle. They weren't being rude, they were creating a cordon. "After you, Colonel," Check 6 said, gesturing for Leslie to enter the aisle. She stood up, grabbed her bag with the lightning bolt patch and smoothed her royal blue blouse. She looked down at Grant, who was still sitting, waiting for her to leave so he could escape the humiliation. "Grant," she said. He looked up, wary. "Yes. Next time you see a woman in a seat you want, Don't assume she's just waiting for her husband. She might be the reason you have the freedom to sell your widgets in the first place. She turned and walked down the aisle, her head high, her gait steady despite the ache in her knee. The 3 pilots fell in behind her, forming a protective wedge, carrying her wake. As they exited the jet bridge and entered the terminal, people watched. They saw a woman in a blue top flanked by 3 uniformed officers. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know she had once held the sky on her shoulders over hostile territory. They didn't know she had saved a wingman by diving into surface-to-air missile fire. But as she walked past, stopping to shake the hands of the young men who idolized her, the crowd sensed it, that invisible weight of command, that quiet, unassuming valor. Leslie Arnold, callsign Viper, adjusted her bag, gave a final nod to the lieutenants, and walked toward the baggage claim. She was just a woman in a crowd again. But for 3 young pilots and 1 humbled defense contractor, the sky would never look quite the same. The pilots watched her go. That, the redhead said quietly, is exactly what I want to be when I grow up. Check 6 clapped him on the shoulder. Then you better start listening more than you talk. They turned and headed toward their next assignment, walking a little taller, inspired by the silent woman in seat 14A. Inside the terminal, Leslie found a quiet corner to call her husband. "Hey," she said when he picked up. "Hey, Ace," his warm voice answered. "How was the flight? Any trouble?" Leslie smiled, watching the planes taxi outside the window. "No trouble," she said. "Just a little turbulence. But I handled it." She always did. If you enjoyed this story of hidden valor and the respect our veterans deserve, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your own stories of unassuming heroes in the comments below. Let's honor those who serve, past and present,